Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Welcome, I'm Alison Stewart and I'm your host of this episode of Cut the Crop, and we're continuing on our international theme with speakers from the UK, and today we've got Fiona Burnett from this Scotland's Rural College with us, and welcome Fiona.
Thanks.
It'll be a little bit late where you are and it's a little bit early where I am, but we seem to have connected, which is great. So thank you very much for making the time to speak to us. So we're going to talk about Ramularia, which is obviously one of your key expertise. So it is a disease that many growers are aware of here. But I think let's just start off with talking about what is Ramularia, its life cycle, and what impact does it have on the crop?
Yeah, no, it's a really key disease and a shared problem between Scotland and New Zealand. So yes, it does have a complex life cycle, and we've worked our way through to the best of our understanding that kind of the fact that it's there right from the early stages of seed development. It's moving up through the plant, transferring leaf to leaf. It has an airborne phase which gives some recirculation of spores between, for example, winter crops and spring crops. It then has that, it's got a long symptomless phase, that link with late stress where the symptoms suddenly pop out. And it's really the spots that are the problem, not the Ramularia per se. And then we also know or suspect that it has a more persistent survival body on straw where it has a sexual stage as well. So really I always think of it as a pathogen that it's not particularly strong at anything, but it's evolved so many different pathways in its life cycle that it just hangs on in all those different, seed, plant, air and straw forms. And of course, it has alternative hosts as well. So we know that it persists in grasses and so on. So yeah, it's a complex beast.
So what kind of yield losses are you experiencing? And is it very much driven by environmental conditions?
You're right. It's driven by environmental conditions very much so. But that really makes the yield loss quite complex because it's so difficult to predict when you're going to have a bad Ramularia year. But in general, we think in terms of yield losses of around 0.2 to 0.5 tonnes per hectare. So it's fairly significant as taken as an average. But of course, an average tells you nothing. You'll have crops there that lose very little and some that are quite severe. We know that the losses spot for spot are actually the same in a winter barley crop as a spring barley crop. So the loss lines are the same. And we also know that it's a disease that it's very much about that loss of green leaf area. So it's not causing additional losses or draws on the plant. It's just that straightforward. If you've lost 50% of your green leaf, you've lost that yield potential that you had. And so all the practices we've got are about trying to hang on to that green leaf in that post-flowering period.
Yeah. So you don't have any sort of forecasting models or anything that the growers use?
That's been the holy grail. And we had one a few years ago, which was very much based on leaf moisture. But again, Ramularia is just not that simple. So absolutely, leaf moisture is one of the factors that drive the Ramularia risk. So at the minute in Scotland, it's actually been quite dry, and that's helpful in reducing Ramularia risk. But what we find is we have real exception years. So in general, it's humidity, it's temperature, but the stress is a big part of how you would predict Ramularia as well. And many of that stress is related to weather. So things like bursts of sunshine, lots of ultraviolet, these are all factors that help to drive the Ramularia risk. So absolutely, we're still working on a predictive system for growers, but it's just not straightforward. And we always steer people towards their previous experience of Ramularia as being one of the kind of key indicators of risk.
Yeah. So obviously, there's a range of fungicides that are available. Sort of are there new fungicides coming on board, or are you now sort of pretty well got a set number of fungicides and you're desperately trying to sort of keep them from having resistance problems building up?
Yeah, Ramularia has a nasty back record of breaking fungicides, so it's developed resistance to the old MBCs, to strobilurins, to SDHIs. So that, and to, there's a decline in the azoles as well. So it's problematic. We do have at least one promising new active coming through in trial series, which is great. But one, when you've lost 4 or 5, is you can see where the balance sits. So at the minute, we're reliant on azoles to manage it. Prothioconazoles still widely used, and we also have a newer azole, which to us is called Revasol. I don't know what the New Zealand branding is, methyltrifluconazole, and that is more effective, but it's still kind of caveated with the general issues that we would have around azoles, where we see that kind of steady decline. So it's a newer azole, more effective, but it's not going to be immune to some of the problems that we have. And then Fulpit, the multi-site, is another kind of key active, a lot of interest in its use in barley, where our results are somewhat inconsistent. But the balance is that it's likely to be helpful in supporting barley programs when it comes to Ramularia. And some of that is probably about reducing the stress in the crop and taking out some of the other diseases as well.
So you talk about the stress in the crop, and in a previous podcast, we were talking about using elicitors. Have you been playing around with elicitors to see whether they may be able to support some of the fungicides?
We have, and some quite nice potential there, where we see them alongside fungicides rather than as direct alternatives. When it comes to Ramularia, though, it's tricky because Ramularia actually runs below the plant's radar, so that until the point where the symptoms pop out, the plant's blissfully unaware that it's there. And obviously, elicitors are triggering resistance mechanisms that have an inherent cost on the plant. So it's a slightly more complicated story with Ramularia, as it always is.
So what is the current advice that you're giving to growers then for, base management practice for Ramularia?
Well, slightly annoyingly probably to growers, we say, of try and avoid stresses. And of course, many of those stresses are out with your control. They're about the weather, and nobody sets out to deliberately stress a crop. But some of the practices, for example, we were getting into situations with kind of 6-7-way tank mixes, where you've got herbicides, growth regulators and fungicides. So that's just one obvious stress that you can avoid putting a crop through. Working on any other sort of obvious deficiencies, nutrient deficiencies, for example, anything that would be an obvious stress trigger, your emergence fungicides. So generally we're on azoles, plus or minus the Fulpit support as being the really key final tool to manage the Ramularia. And I guess the other piece of advice we're really keen on is just that people become confident in recognising Ramularia. So the kind of symptoms of, those little red squarish lesions that go right through the leaf, bounded by the veins. So just kind of being observant and being confident in what you recognise, because we still see a lot of spotty crops kind of misascribed to Ramularia, and that's not helpful in building your on-farm experience of what your Ramularia risk is likely to be.
Do any of your existing cultivars have any, tolerance to Ramularia?
Sadly, not a huge amount. So, that lesson learned that many varieties are all derived from fairly common genetic stock. But that absolutely, Alison, is where the future would be, that we would have better and more resilient varieties. We have dropped some of the poorer ones. So, some of the varieties that were particularly prone to spotting are now, kind of gone. But encouragingly, from European breeding programs, there is better resilience there, but it obviously takes a while to bring that through into commercially viable crops. But yeah, that's where current lines of research are going.
I mean, it's a bit like, what's happening in New Zealand, where a lot of our early cultivar sort of evaluation work was very much focused on, yield. And now, there's a lot more work looking at traits around disease tolerance or suppression or whatever, because the fungicides are not necessarily going to be there. And, it comes back to that previous podcast where we were talking about integrated pest management. Relying on, a couple of good fungicides is probably not a very sensible or sustainable practice. And we really have to start integrating and mixing and matching a whole range of different options.
Yeah, no, I mean, we can be very wise in hindsight now, but we were the same. Our varietal testing programs were set up to show you the varieties that did best in very high input situations. That's what we asked for them to do. And now we've got the result that we have varieties that need a lot of inputs to get those results. And the move back to more resilient varieties takes a while, but the breeders are on it. And, I think we just need to support them by then using those varieties and getting comfortable with them in programs.
Sort of final question, what do you see as in the next 5 years? What do you see the situation with Ramularia looking like for UK growers?
I think it'll still be with us, sadly. I would like to think that at the end of 5 years, we will have some of those more resilient varieties in programs out there on farm, and that will be helpful. I would really like to hope that the newer fungicide actives that we see coming through will be in use and be helping to manage the situation. But I also really hope that we don't make the same mistake of just relying on a new fungicide tool and then, breaking it within a season or two.
Yeah, hindsight is a wonderful thing. And I think that, sometimes your failures can point you in the best direction to your likely success. And I don't think we've necessarily been as good at learning from our failures as we could have been. So it's not a dismal future, but it's very much a future where growers have to learn to manage not only Ramularia, but all the other cohort of pests and pathogens on their crop.
And obviously barley has a good range of other pathogens that we're trying to manage as well. And maybe important to mention that they in and of themselves are stressful to the plant and can, help to precipitate more of a Ramularia infection. So yeah, it's always tricky if we only ever focus on a single pathogen at a time. It's bringing the whole lot together.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Fiona. And thank you very much, listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.